In this video, we're going to compare Selenium with a codeless automation tool. So as you can see, the first criteria is ease of use, because we have to work smart. We don't have to work hard, and you don't have to do any over engineering to do a simple task such as test automation. So let's first take a look at Selenium. If you're going to use Selenium, you can choose between different programming languages. You can choose between Java, Python, Ruby, C#, and so on. In my example, I'm going to use Python because I think it's the easiest one. The syntax is really easy to use. The setup is quick and simple. So if you would install Python on your Windows or Mac machine, and the other dependencies that you might need, it would take you around maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes. It depends. And you can find plenty of resources online. So this is how your first Selenium script will look like. You're going to import all the dependencies. You're going to have a function that starts the driver. In this case, we're going to use the Chrome driver, which is the web driver for Chrome. As you can see, you can add all sorts of preferences and options. And let's say that we want to create a test case for this page. So the first thing that we need to do is that we need to access that page, like I'm doing here with the driver get method. Now, let's say I want to write the first name in this input. So I need to get the locator. So I need to inspect the element, and I can see that this element has the following ID. So I can write something like this: driver find element by ID. I will paste that ID. I will use the send keys method to write the first name. For the next step, I can just copy paste this one. I need to get the locator for the second input, which is last name. Okay, let's do that copy paste again. For the email address, the input has the ID. Okay. Just write some random email here. And then once again, another copy paste, because I want to write the password, which has the following ID password. Okay, just some random password. And for the last step, I need to click on this button. But as you can see, this button is not active. So in order to make it active, let's add some text in those inputs. The button is now active. But this button doesn't have an ID, it doesn't have a name. So we're going to need to get the XPath like this. So we can do something like driver find element by XPath. I'll paste the XPath here and then click. Okay, let's paste that XPath. Oh, it's an ugly one. Okay, so this is the test. Now, if you want to run it, you can just go to your terminal if you're on a Mac OS. If you're on a Windows, you can go to the command prompt. Okay, I'm in the right place. So Python test. Let's see what happens. Okay, awesome. We created our first test with Selenium. Okay. Of course, as you might have noticed, it mentioned that it sent an email. If you want to do, let's say, a complete end-to-end test, you're going to have to find a way to check that email. You can either use some online disposable email service, which I do not recommend, or you can connect with an API to your Outlook server or something like that and fetch the email. So you're going to need to write some extra code for that part. It's also worth mentioning that, as you can see, we don't have any logs. So I know that the test was okay because I saw it. I saw the steps as they were being executed, but we don't have any screenshots, we don't have any logs, we don't have any assertions, we don't have any proof that the test actually passed. So you're also going to need to add those. Okay, now let's try to do the same thing with nTest. So let me just copy this URL. So nTest is a cloud platform where you can create and execute automated tests without having to write any code. So you don't need to install anything, you just sign up. Actually, you do need to install the nTest Chrome extension, which will help you record tests. So if we want to start, we just need to paste this URL here. We click on the Start Recording button, and we just use this section like a normal user would. Okay, just some random password. As you can see, the steps are recorded here. So if you look at each step, it has a description, and the engine from nTest, if your element has an ID, it will use that ID, as long as that ID is unique on the page. If not, it will use the name. If not, it will write maybe some XPath or some CSS selector. As you can see, this XPath here looks a lot better than the one generated by the Chrome developer tools. So you can also add assertions on the fly. So it's really easy to add them like I just did now. So let's stop the recording. Let's give this test case a name. Let's save it in a new test suite. Okay, so we have it here. It's saved in the cloud. You can see all the steps. You can easily change the steps. So because this is not code, anyone can read this, even a non-technical person. So a manual tester can easily build automated tests. Now, if we look at this example here at this step, you can see that I use this random email with the nTest mail domain. And what this does, it allows me to check that email automatically. So all I have to do is access a URL and put that email in that certain URL here. And as you can see, I'm able to access this email here. So I can just, create a test case which is accessing this nTest mailbox, and it clicks on the button, or it fetches this activation code, or whatever I might need to either verify the functionality or to, let's say, complete the sign-up process. Obviously, instead of using a hard-coded email, you're probably going to generate a random email for each test execution. So you can use the set variable action and generate a random email with this domain instead of the hard-coded one. So, now this test is also reusable. If I execute it 100 times, it will generate 100 different emails. Okay. Let's move on to the next criteria. So flexibility, which is obviously really important. Now, a deal breaker for codeless tools a few years ago was the fact that they do not offer flexibility. People wanted to add if statements, they wanted to add loops, they wanted to use variables to reuse components. For example, if you have a login component, you want to reuse that one in several test suites. You don't want to write the same steps, to copy paste the same steps again and again and again, because it won't make any sense. Now, for example, let's take a look at a complex scenario where we would need some flexibility. Let's take a look at this page. This page is interesting because if we click on this button, you can see it opens a new browser tab. And these elements here, they're inside an iframe. So when we do this, we're actually inside the iframe. So this adds a layer of complexity. So let's see how this test would look like in Selenium. I already wrote it earlier to save you from the pain of watching me write code. Okay, so you can see here we're accessing that page. Then we have a step to click on that button. Because that button doesn't have an ID, we end up with this really ugly XPath. Then we switch to the next tab, and then we fetch the iframe and switch the focus to that iframe, and then we use that select. Now, this code, it does make sense, but if a manual tester would take a look at this code, it wouldn't be so easy to read. You're not sure exactly what's happening here. I mean, window handles 1. How many handles are there? Should I start from 0, from 1? What if I already have 2 tabs open? Do I have 2 or 3? You know, it's not so intuitive. So let's compare it, for example, with NTest. So let's say I want to do the same steps in NTest. So I can just, put this URL here, start recording, click on this button, and then select this option, click here. So let's see what we get. So you can see you have the first step, which generated an XPath, which looks a lot nicer than the one generated by the Chrome developer tools. Then we have a step to switch to the next browser tab. And then we have a step to switch to the iframe, to select the option and to click. Let's also save this one. So let's call it complex random suite. So if you take a look here, it's very human readable. So you have step-by-step instructions, exactly what's happening. You have switch to next tab, you have switch to previous tab. It's a lot easier to read and understand than Selenium in this case. It's also worth mentioning to like NTest, you can add if statements, you can add loops, you can add variables. So you can have pretty much anything that you would have if you would write code. Now, let's go back to this criteria. A lot of people mention that flexibility is the most important criteria, that they want to use the tool or the library which offers them the most flexibility. But this approach is incorrect. And here's an example why. Out of these two options, which one offers you the most flexibility? Is it the first one, the machine code with ones and zeros, or is it the second one, the Python code? Obviously, the first one offers you more flexibility because you can do whatever you want. There is no limit. But writing machine code, it will give you all the flexibility you want, but the ROE will be terrible. You will spend weeks, months, years trying to create something with that. So that's why flexibility isn't the only aspect that you should consider. For the next part, collaboration. So realistically speaking, you're not the only one who's going to work on those automated tests. You're going to work together with your colleagues. Doesn't matter if they're testers, developers, DevOps. So let's go back to that Selenium example, like I did here. So you can see here, this is a no-no. If I would push this code to Git and another colleague would try to use it, it would not work for him because he has a different file path. So we need to make, changes, improvements to make this code, let's say, portable, to make it work on different machines. And our code also needs to look nice. It needs to be readable. It needs to follow some best practices because you're not the only one who's going to work on that code. And if you don't start using good practices, things will, start to get messy pretty soon. So, like I said, if you want to work with other colleagues on these tests, you would have to push them to Git or SVN or some other, let's say, source control solution. With Ntest, it's a bit different because it's already in the cloud. So the tests are already, let's say, stored in a repository. So in this case, if I want to, let's say, share this test with a colleague, all I need to do is I need to add them here. And now they have instant access. If they log in with their account, they will see this test here and they'll be able to work on it. And it's also worth mentioning that you can create backups, automatic backups. So if your colleague, accidentally deletes some steps, you can just go to a previous backup, restore it, and there's no damage. So let's say you have all of the advantages of a Git, of an SVN. It's just a lot easier to use. Okay, moving on. Oof, this is a good one, cross-browser capabilities. So realistically speaking, you will need to test on more than one browser. If you're developing some internal app, it's okay to test only on Chrome and Firefox, but for anything else, you're going to need to test on Internet Explorer, on Edge, on Safari, on mobile browsers. As I mentioned here, Safari has an 18% market share, which is huge. So let's take a look at Selenium. As you might have seen here, for example, I'm starting the Chrome driver, right? But if I will need to start this test on Firefox, I will need to add other lines of code because Firefox, it uses a different web driver, it uses the Gecko driver, it has different configuration options. Safari as well is using the Safari driver. You can also install Edge on your MacBook, but for Internet Explorer, you're going to need access to some kind of Windows machine, either an internal virtual machine or something in a cloud grid, internal or external, but you are going to need to have tests in Internet Explorer. And the tricky part with cross-browser testing, it is not that, okay, you start the Chrome driver, you start the Firefox driver, and you have the exact same code, because there are a lot of differences for each method. And I have here some examples. For example, something very simple. Let's say you want to get the tag name for an element, right? You want to know if that element, you want to verify if it's a button, it's an input, it's a span. So if your test is running on Chrome, you can just do this, get the property of that element, tag name. It works fine, it's perfect. But if your test is going to run on Safari, this code will give you an error, it won't work. So you need to add this piece of overcomplicated code, which uses some JavaScript to extract the tag name with JavaScript, and then return it here in this variable. That's one example. Another example, let's say you want to get the text from an element, and you're going to do that a lot because you're going to have assertions. And for example, you folks need to check if your element is an input or a text area or a select, or if it's just a div or a span. And for Chrome, you can just use the text property. It works great. But this code, if you would execute it on Safari, it would not work. So you need to get the attribute called inner text, and then you need to trim it because it also returns the double quotes from the start and the end, and so on. So for each method that you will have, when you click on something, when you execute some JavaScript, when you fetch a value, you will have different code for different browsers. In some cases, the same code might work on Chrome, might work on Firefox, but for other browsers, you're going to need to add changes. So expect that you'll have a lot of if statements for each method, for each action that you create. And it's important to test on all browsers from the very beginning, because You don't want to end up in a situation where you have been working on your tests for a few months. You've been, running them on Chrome, and then when the release day happens, you won't. You want to execute the tests on Firefox and Internet Explorer, and you'll find out that your tests they do not work. So that would be very embarrassing. The difference with the codeless tool like Ntest is that all of those, let's say, differences are handled on their side. So for example, let's say in your test, you want to extract the value from an element, right? You can do something like this, extract value from element. You just provide the locator, and this piece of code, it will work. Actually, this step, not this piece of code, it will work on all browsers from the start because they handle this on their side. So if your test is working on Chrome, it will also work on the rest of the browsers. Now, and speaking of that, of cross-browser, another advantage with this Ntest tool is that you have a cross-browser cloud included. So instead of installing Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer on your machine or different machines, when you run a test, you can just connect to their cloud grid, and they have a bunch of Windows machines with browsers on Windows and a bunch of macOS machines with browsers on macOS and mobile devices as well. So you don't have to worry about configuring the Chrome driver, about starting mobile emulators, and so on. This makes it a bit easier to do cross-browser testing. And you also have geolocation. So let's say you want to test that your e-commerce site, it looks the way you expect it to look in France or in the UK or in Canada. So you can just use this geolocation feature. If you would try to do the same thing with Selenium, you would either need some machines on AWS or you would need some proxy, and you would have to configure that proxy for each browser or for the entire machine. So it gets a bit complicated. Okay, the next criteria, implementation cost. This is very important because 5 years ago, when you started a test automation initiative, nobody asked you about this. They would just say, hey, can you write some automated tests? Sure. Use whatever you want. You're the expert. Use whichever tool you think is best. But today things are a bit different because, for example, let's say that you choose to use Selenium. Selenium is completely free, completely open source. There are no strings attached. And it's free to use. You automatically think that the cost of the implementation will be zero because you're already hired. You're using something that costs $0, right? But it's not exactly like that because think of it this way. You will need to calculate the ROE. So when you calculate the ROE, you have to take into consideration, okay, how many hours will you work on this? Because if you're going to reinvent the wheel, you're going to spend a lot of hours, writing if statements, checking if your tests work as expected on all the browsers, creating an implementation, for checking emails, for checking SMS messages, setting up a cross-browser cloud grid, maybe you'll set up a Windows machine on AWS or something like that. You'll also have to integrate it with your CI/CD system. Maybe you're using Jenkins, GitHub, I don't know. So you'll have to create some kind of API or some kind of webhooks to allow your tests to communicate. Because, in the longer run, your objective is for your test to run automatically when a build happens. You don't want to be the one who manually triggers the tests from their machine because what happens when you're on vacation? Who's going to run those tests? And it's also important, to train other colleagues to use and adopt your tests or your testing framework. Because, for example, if you're going, so I wrote a lot of code just for a test that takes 3 seconds. Imagine when you will have, tests that run for maybe half an hour or 40 minutes. You will have so much code, and it needs to be easy to read. It needs to be understandable. You need to take the time and train your colleagues and show them how it works. For example, if you look at N-Test, because it's a cloud tool, it has a cost, it has a price. But if you do the math, if you do the calculations, a lot of things are actually included in this cost. For example, the cross-browser cloud grid, it's included in this cost. It has an API, so you can easily integrate it with your CI/CD system. It has all sorts of built-in integrations for Jira, Slack, GitHub, and so on. So you don't need to work on those. And it's a lot easier to read and understand than Python code. So, for example, if a new tester would join your team, they would immediately understand what's happening and they could add value to your tests starting from day one, instead of looking at code and taking a few days or a few weeks to learn this code. In general, from what I know, it's a bad practice to build an internal tool or some framework if that tool or framework is not the thing that your company is going to sell to make money. So, for example, think of it this way. You're using Zoom, right, for your video calls, for your meetings. Zoom has a price tag, so you spend maybe $20 per month on Zoom. But you could use the open source library WebRTC to create your own video calling solution, right? So it's free to use, it's open source, but you will spend weeks, months, or maybe even more to create that internal video calling tool. So if you do that, the cost will go up significantly. So your employer will spend a lot more, unless of course you're working for free. Okay, moving on to the next one. So like I said, modern applications, they need to be tested with end-to-end capabilities. So these are things which are not included in Selenium that you will need to use in your tests. You will need to do visual comparison, right? So to see if your page, if your elements are pixel perfect and if they look as expected. Like I said, you will need to check the emails. You will probably need to check SMS messages. You will have to send API requests. For example, when you're starting a test, maybe you need some test data to be inserted in a database. So you can either do that with a send API request or by executing a SQL query. So these are things that you will have to work on. You will have to build them from scratch. With a codeless tool like N-Test, these are included, so you don't have to build them from scratch. You just use them as they are. Okay, the next one, reliability. This is also important because, your tests are important. You cannot risk, having your tests not work when you need them the most. For example, let's say that your team is planning to release a patch today and you want to execute a test, and then you see that you have an error or you can't execute a test. That would be very bad because all the value that was supposed to come from your tests is not there. So it would be a very tricky situation. So you need to choose the solution which is the most reliable. So think of it like this. For example, Selenium, it's open source. Most people are saying that open source software is very reliable because, if somebody doesn't fix the bug, I can just jump in and fix the bug myself. Well, that might sound like something that could happen, but realistically speaking, people don't have time to fix their own bugs. And, fixing a bug in an open source package is not actually that easy, because you need to be familiar with that package. You need to know what's happening. So you will also have, a very steep learning curve to see exactly how that works internally and what you need to change. So if Selenium or some WebDriver, it will have a bug inside, you'll have to wait for the next update, or you'll have to use an older version, or you'll have to find some crazy workaround. The same thing is actually not available with Ntest or other codeless tools, because bugs are fixed. So they have an active team behind it. So an active development team which fixes the bugs, and you can, if you ever find the bug, you can just report it and it will be fixed in like 24 hours, something like that. So the reliability is a bit better. One major myth about using proprietary solutions is vendor lock-in. A lot of people will say that, okay, but I don't want any vendor lock-in. I don't want, and what is this vendor lock-in? This vendor lock-in means that you start using a solution which is proprietary, and let's say at some point that service is no longer so great, or they keep increasing the price, and you want to move to a different service, and you can't, because they don't offer any options to migrate your data in a compatible way, or it's really difficult. So you're stuck with that vendor and you have to pay the price. That is a nightmare scenario, but you have to take into consideration that most modern tools, they implement GDPR and HIPAA, let's say, rules. So your data is your data. You can easily grab it whenever you want in different formats. So no one is trying to lock you in 2020. So that's, I think, the least of your concern. But again, when you start using a tool, you should always check, okay, if I will stop using that tool, can I get my data? How can I do that? You can ask support, you can check the documentation, you can look for buttons. A lot of information like that usually can be found in the privacy policy, because it's, let's say, sensitive data related to GDPR and so on. And also the question of community or support, For example, when using an open source tool, you have the community. Maybe a lot of people are using it, maybe they'll try to answer your questions, but for the most part, you might find the answers or you might not, but you will spend some minutes, you will spend some hours looking on Stack Overflow and trying all the workarounds. It's good to remember that, the most voted answer is not always the solution which works for you. So I would check all the answers and try the workarounds that are provided. As for support, Selenium doesn't offer any support because it's open source. But for example, Ntest, they offer support. So it's a technical support. It's actually really good. So if you have an issue at any point, you can just write to the support team and they will help you. You can just say, hey, I'm getting this error when I try to click on the sign up button or anything like that. And they can help you, so you don't have to dig around the internet looking for answers. Here's an interesting example actually that I recently saw from Selenium. So for example, it's about bugs. So in 2015, somebody reported this bug for the Chrome driver, which is the web driver for Chrome. It was about getting this error message. And this was happening back in 2015. And you would think that, okay, it's a pretty serious issue. They would fix it in the next release. But in 2018, it still wasn't fixed. And, you sometimes get this attitude that, okay, this issue is too old, please open another issue. You haven't replied in 48 hours, we'll close this issue, and so on. So you depend a lot on those, let's say, those contributors. And in 2019, we can see that there were a lot of posts about how to find workarounds for this problem. So I looked all over Stack Overflow, to find if anyone found a solution for that problem, and you had all sorts of workarounds. and someone was saying, okay, this one worked for me, and someone else was saying, yeah, but this didn't work for me, and so on. And in 2020, someone reported the bug again. So this will probably happen, we'll go through the same cycle again, maybe another 2 years, or another 3 years, or another 5 years, or, maybe someone will fix it next week. You never know. But I mean, in all this time, in 5 years, no one who has been using this Chrome driver bothered to fix it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people were bothered by it, but no one had the actual time to fix it. So that's something that you should also take into consideration. That's pretty much for this video. I hope you enjoyed it.